I've long been convinced with girls, it's not that they want to be boys or think they're boys, they're opting out of becoming women.
Hi, I'm Jane.
I'm Terry.
I'm Lucy.
And I'm Bex.
And we are
Insightful Sisters.
Hi, everybody. We've been looking forward to this episode. We've got Terry Patterson and Lucy Benny from Thoughtful Therapists here. Thoughtful Therapists was set up by James Esses, and in your description, what particularly jumped out at me was that it's the freedom to practice ordinary exploratory therapy, which is such a lovely sort of grounding thing, isn't it? So Terry is a psychodynamic counsellor who's worked with universities since the 90s as a counsellor and manager, and is now in private practice. Lucy Benny has worked in a secondary school for 5 years and also in private practice. Lucy's produced a report for the Family Education Trust, and she's currently the children's correspondent for the campaign group Save Mental Health. So we're really delighted to see you. We're going to try and talk a lot about education and schools and universities because that's really your expertise, but just a general sort of look into therapy for those of us that don't know an awful lot about it. So we'll pass across to Bex and she's going to ask a few questions.
Hi both. I suppose a good place to start, because I think a lot of lay people aren't quite sure between the distinction. What's the difference between therapists, counsellors, life coaches, psychologists? What is a therapist?
Well, I think that probably requires a whole dissertation to answer that one. But it is one of the first things they teach you when you start your training, actually. The different types of advice giving as opposed to counselling. We don't give advice as counsellors and therapists. We listen. We try and help people to get an overview and a picture of what's going on in their lives, and to help them to think about what's going on for them internally and externally. We help them to make links between the past and the present and identify patterns of behaviour. Coaching is more like helping people come up with solutions to problems. And solving specific issues that are not right in their lives. Psychologists are more measured in terms of they measure their outcomes a lot more. It's more scientifically based, whereas counselling and therapy is more intuitive.
Yes, I think one important point to make is that psychologists, the title psychologist, is a protected title. So you have to go through certain training and you have to belong to a regulatory body. One of the issues, and it's quite a hot potato at the moment, is that counsellors, psychotherapists, various other sorts of therapists are not regulated. They have membership bodies which have a sort of regulatory function in that they manage registers for the Professional Standards Association, but they don't actually regulate. So literally anybody could call themselves a counsellor or a therapist or a psychotherapist, which is an issue in some circumstances. But otherwise, I would agree with Terry. I think the only thing I would say that's slightly different is working with teenagers and children. And I haven't done that much work with under 11s, mainly with teenagers, is you sometimes are a little bit more directive in that you have a safeguarding role, and it's easier to say that's not a good idea, or don't go down that rabbit hole in a way that perhaps you wouldn't say to an adult.
That's really interesting, actually. We seem to be seeing a lot more sort of awareness campaigns around mental health, around neurodiversity. I wonder, being a therapist yourself, have you seen attitudes to therapy and mental health actually change in response to that?
I would say yes, and certainly in school, not always for the better, in that we're walking a very fine line, in that it is good that when people have issues, when people don't feel good, that they can speak up. But we've got to a point where almost everything is about mental health and keeping yourself well, to the extent that a lot of children find it very hard to believe that I have never woken up in the morning and thought, how do I feel today? That there are children who are taught to do that in these whole school mental health initiatives. Be aware of your feelings, check in with yourself. And some of that is counterproductive.
As Lucy said, it's part of the general discourse in universities amongst students is everybody talks about their mental health. And, it's not very helpful, really, because then the ones that really do have serious problems often get overlooked or don't turn up or end up on a waiting list in front of lots and lots and lots of other students with not really very serious problems, just ordinary life issues.
That's fascinating. I mean, I used to work in Ascend College, and I know a lot of the parents there, where their children had very severe needs, were fed up of people with higher functioning autism, for example, taking up the space and, being presented as the loudest voice in campaigns. People feel that we're pathologizing and becoming overzealous about everybody having a diagnosis or finding the box they fit in. What's your view on that discussion?
I think part of the clue is in what you just said, Bex, about everyone trying to find the box that they fit in. And I think that that's a very new attitude, in that before, and certainly when I was at school, is a very long time ago, there were just different people, and different people had different talents, different things they were afraid of, different strengths. And it was all much less prescriptive. And identity has traditionally been something which has grown organically, starting with your place in your family, in your community, perhaps in a faith group. And onto that, you build your own preferences, your own interests, your own talents, your own experiences will shape who you become. So that by the time you are working your way through the teenage years, you have a sense of who you are, and it's being refined. But in the absence of some of those early factors being as strong as they once were, you've got children who are looking for an identity, which is completely the wrong way round. And so they're looking for a box to fit into rather than gravitating towards something which is of interest to them, or people with whom they share something in common, people they just get along with. It's a kind of tick box exercise. And of course, a lot of these boxes are either overlapping, or some of them are mutually exclusive. If you're that, then you can't be this. But that totally reduces the experience of being a human being, where much more often than not, we are both and rather than either or. So you can be this and you can be that, and both can be true. But when you're picking labels and boxes and trying to fit yourself into a box, it becomes a very performative thing rather than a real and authentic thing, which is how identity and character and personality has traditionally developed.
Yeah, and I think there's an issue around the labels that are used to describe our feelings used to be just labels for feelings, like I feel depressed or I feel anxious, were temporary passing states of mind. Whereas now they've turned into I am depressed or I am anxious, as though they are part of your identity. I've certainly seen this grow and grow and grow in universities, where once they brought in legislation which included mental health in the definition of disability, and the Special Education Needs and Disability Act came in 2001, it meant that any student who had a mental health issue which was diagnosed as a disability could get extra help. So if, for example, you then have an explosion in the number of students claiming anxiety as a reason why they need to have exam rooms separate from other people, and they need extra time, and they need scribes, and they need all kinds of extra support. And the fact is that once you get into that situation, there's so much secondary gain from having that identity as anxious that it's a permanent feature. It's something that's then immovable. Whereas, anxiety is usually a situational anxiety, and that I spent the last 15 years of my career saying the same thing to hundreds of students every day, which is you're in a situation where you're being tested. It's a new situation. You've just left home. You're away from everything. Everything's new. You're going to feel anxious. That's part of the experience. You have to expect that feeling anxious is a normal part of this, and you'll find ways of managing it, and you'll feel better for having survived it in the long run. Whereas they thought feeling anxious meant that there was something wrong with them. And I think this is the message we've given people, that unless they have a perfect, happy, peaceful state of mind at all times, they have a mental health issue. If they feel any kind of depression or anxiety or any kind of discomfort emotionally, that's a mental health issue. And I think we've really gone down the wrong road with that.
And I think that a lot of what Terry has just said is very true in school as well. I mean, one of the saddest situations is when you meet a young teenager, for example, for the first time, and you say, tell me a bit about yourself. And they say, well, I've got ADHD and I'm on the spectrum and I've got anger issues and my mum thinks I've got this, that, and the next thing. And you say, well, hold on a minute. Tell me a bit about yourself. And they look blank. And it's like, well, what else is there to know? And so you then go down the route of saying, well, tell me a bit about your family. What do you like doing? Do you have any pets? And you try to divert them away from themselves, because this is part of the problem. Is it's all about me and how I'm feeling and all the disorders that I have. And then, of course, as Terry said, if you have some of these diagnoses, you get extra time in exams. You can sit in a separate room. For some families, particularly families on benefits, there are increased payments. Schools can get extra funding if they have, an increased number of special needs children. There are a whole lot of things working together in this, which I am not convinced is for the benefit of children.
Yeah. I mean, yet again, I come back to my time in SEND schools and the sheer amount of time and thought we put into enablement and encouraging independence skills. And it's funny how there's such a focus on that in that space. And it seems for the general public, we're sending out the opposite message and we're sort of almost coddling rather than saying, okay, you've got this. Well, let's look at the steps that we can go through to help you continue on independently and assimilate, I suppose. You mentioned there, you touched on, my mum thinks I have this and we think I have that. It does seem that there's a trend of self-diagnosis at play here. And obviously it's important to take patient experiences into account, but in particular, ADHD, autism and gender dysphoria are hugely self-diagnosed. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Is that social media or where's that come from and why?
I think social media causes some of it and amplifies a lot of other things around it, simply because, as I've said, a lot of things are interlinked here. And one of the most notable things I've discovered with particularly teenagers who I was seeing is the amount of time they spend on their own. One of the assessment questions I used to ask is, do you spend too much time on your own? Invariably, the answer was yes. So a lot of these children are going home to an empty house and their device is their friend. And so whether they're getting information or talking about these things with peers and it becomes peer group pressure, or you've probably read about sociogenic, where one lot of people are doing this and I want to be part of that, so I'm going to do it too. Or whether it's literally millions of influencers out there who will tell you, the positive things about having ADHD, or the signs that you're autistic, the signs that you're, pathologically demand avoidant. And all these conditions are growing all the time, both in the number of people who claim to have them, but also the number of actual conditions that almost every week I hear about something and I think, oh, what's that? I haven't heard of that. And it's a variation on something else. So yes, I think there is a very large part played by social media, but it's able to take root in people's minds because a lot of these children are not getting information, stimulation, company anywhere else. They're just literally sitting there. I mean, there was a survey recently. I think it was the most recent census information. I may be wrong on that, but 25% of children spend 7 hours a day at weekends on social media. So that's like a quarter of children.
So yes, I've noticed this very much over the years in universities where, in the old days, if you ever had an American student, you could guarantee they would come in and they would give you a list of their diagnoses. And it's because of the American health system that they have to have labels in order to get insurance, their medical insurance. So it used to be just Americans, but increasingly, after the advent of the iPhone, particularly after 2012, there was a huge growth in the number of people coming in and being like the Americans, coming in and saying, I've got ADHD, I've got social anxiety disorder, I've got oppositional disorder, all these kind of spurious, made up kind of labels. And that really took hold in universities to the extent that, we had huge numbers of students asking the counselling service for letters to support mitigating circumstances.
Yeah.
And, it would go around a particular cohort. We had a whole group of 30 medical students all applying for mitigating circumstances one year. And we got to the point where we had to stop giving the letters at all because it was a joke, because everybody was diagnosing themselves with mental health issues. It's crazy.
I mean, you use the phrase made up. So I'm just going to stop and ask about that. I'm not an expert, so you're going to have to help me. So we've got things like ADHD, there's ADD, and then you talked about oppositional defiance disorder. Do you want to tell us a bit about that and what perhaps the original diagnosis was hoping to capture, and how the self-diagnosis has muddied the waters, maybe?
Well, I was listening to a podcast the other day. I don't know if you've heard of this amazing woman called Joanna Moncrief. She's a professor at UCL and a psychiatrist, and she did the recent study that came out in the press a while ago about how, antidepressants have been proven that they don't actually help, because her whole argument is that there isn't any biological basis to any kind of mental health disorder, apart from perhaps extreme things like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So all of these labels that we make up, they're not real. They are just people's way of trying to describe, bringing together a number of symptoms and putting them in a group and saying, we'll give that a label. But the human condition is incredibly complex and incredibly varied and unique for each person, depending on their history and their circumstances now. And so it's impossible really to give validation to a lot of these labels.
An interesting point is that the sort of base text for all this is the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is produced in America. And when it first started several decades ago, there were, I think, 100 and something conditions. I can't remember exactly. But now there are over 400 variations. And so we could literally spend the rest of our time talking about the different variations of these things and how they have been manipulated, particularly to ensure that somebody who has a diagnosis still keeps a diagnosis, even if the criteria changes. And an awful lot of this is done through just agreement of people talking in a room, not through scientific discovery and everything. And I think another really important point to make, for example, when talking about how people are diagnosed, what Terry said is very important. You have to look at the complexity of the background. I mean, I think that an awful lot of ADHD is actually something else. It's not a disorder that is wrong with people. It is a response often to life circumstances, environment, experience, and relationship. And I can give you an example of that. For example, I used to work on a school readiness project, and I used to work with a lot of very young single parents, usually single mothers, with a very young child. And the idea was you would come alongside them to help prepare both of them for the day when the child would go to school. Now, a lot of these young women had various issues of their own. Many of them were estranged from their own families. They'd been abandoned by the father of the child. The child had become, in many ways, their emotional support. Some of these young women found it very hard to function if the child wasn't with them. Now, if you then imagine a child whose entire experience of life has been rather isolated with one rather needy adult, and you then put that child into a class of 30 when they're 4 years old, turning 5, going into reception, the results are predictable. And the child won't sit down. The child won't do what they're told. They're missing their mother. They've never had to share. They've had no structure, no routine to their day. But the first question we ask is, well, what's wrong with them? I think maybe they've got ADHD. Maybe they've got this, that, the next thing. But in fact, it's all stemming from the experience of life that child has had. You know, just to put a label on it in many ways massively simplifies it and means that we don't actually look at what's going on underneath. And I've given that as one example, but that is the case in so much of this. It's let us sit down and actually look at what's going on here and how this could be avoided in the future.
Because there's a huge investment in this, in that there's an industry behind it. So if you can give something a label, then you can give it a solution. And the solution is often pharmacological. So you can get a profit out of it. So the more people that you have labeling themselves and going to their physicians and asking for help and being given some kind of medication, the more profit there is. It's not helpful usually to the individual, only in that it lets them off the hook in a way, because rather than thinking, I feel bad, I'm not happy, I've got problems, what can I do to solve them? Rather than that, they think there's something wrong with me. I have no control over this. It's an illness, and I have to just accept that and get all the help I can to try and live some kind of life. It's not helpful in terms of developing and growing and becoming a happier, healthier adult.
So the distress is real.
Yes. I mean, an example at secondary level is, and I've come across this lots of times, children who are thought to be unable to concentrate, very reactive, won't sit still. A lot of them are actually only physically present at school. Mentally, they're somewhere else, usually at home, because they're worried about what's going on in their absence. If you, for example, have a child where there's domestic violence in the home, they're wondering what's going on when they're not there. Sometimes you'll find a child, they live with, only with their father, and the father has a drink problem. Is he going to be drunk by the time I get home from school? And that's quite before you get to other kinds of reactivity where, there's a lot of shouting, there's maybe violence, and nearly all the children where the teachers say, they never concentrate, or they always look like they're somewhere else. They are, because there's so much going on in their life that it's very difficult for them to look at what the teacher's doing and follow along with it. But a lot of this is not necessarily understood.
And there's a major issue that we haven't spoken about, which is that all of these symptoms, like depression, anxiety, the two main ones, they are naturally developed part of our evolutionary development. They're meant to be listened to and taken notice of. If we listen to them and think, what's happening inside of me, what's happening in my life that's making me feel like this, we're listening to our natural evolved mechanisms within us that are there to wave red flags when something's not right. And if we're ignoring them, then we're going to be in these very narrow train tracks that we're going along without thinking about what we need to change in order to get onto a different journey. So it's not just unhelpful in the here and now, it's also robbing people of the opportunity to change their lives and become happier, more healthy, functioning people. If you're down and you're depressed, I often think of it as your mind's way of pressing the pause button. It's saying stop, retreat, take some time. Because you're going down the wrong track, and you need to rethink which direction your life's going in. And similarly with anxiety, if you're highly anxious about something, it's telling you it's dangerous. Anxiety is a fear reaction. So we need to think about what you're doing that you maybe need to change or confront in your life. So we're missing a huge amount of biochemical information that's going on inside of us and sending these feelings into our minds and our bodies. If we ignore them, then we're ignoring our humanity, really. Sounds a bit dramatic, but, it's very basic to our historical development as human beings that we have these feelings. They're not there as a nuisance. They're there for a reason.
Do you think that there's something about our modern way of living that is really causing a lot of the distress that we see in young people?
What I've noticed is that young people expect a great deal more control over certain elements of their life than historically maybe people did. And what I mean by that is that when we were young, there were 3 television channels. There was one TV in the sitting room. There was one telephone in the hall. People had to negotiate. People had to compromise. We'd all sit down to eat together. Now, a lot of children, particularly by the time they become teenagers, are effectively living in an environment which is almost entirely controlled by them. They listen to what they want to listen to. They watch what they want when they want. They eat when they get hungry. They spend a lot of time in their bedroom on their own, as we discussed earlier. They have become less and less able to deal with situations which are not in their control. And if you add into that the fact that a lot of young people have chaotic lives. I mean, almost half of children by the time they're 14 no longer live with both their parents. And that's just a very dry headline statistic. But underneath that, there is so much heartbreak, family breakup, So you've got chaos at one point, you've got them used to having control at another, and often the way they deal with the chaos is to exert even more control. And therefore, when they can't, it's very anxiety inducing. This is why so many young people don't want to make telephone calls. I think it was in a survey fairly recently, one of the scariest things you can ask a young person to do is phone up somebody they don't know. It's because they have no idea how the other person's going to respond. So there's this loss of a willingness to take a risk or to put yourself into a position where you cannot be certain of the outcome. And that translates across into the dating scene. It translates across into all sorts of aspects of life. And when you can't control, you become anxious. And if you feel that you have no control over everything, you can become depressed. I mean, anxiety and depression are in some ways two sides of the same coin. Because you're depressed because you're anxious. But it all feeds off, I think, this unreasonable expectation of having control over things which previously we understood we didn't have control over.
There's also the element of the fact that everything that children are seeing online is about the happy things, all the TikTok videos and stuff. That gives a very false representation of what human life is like. And, you get students turning up at university at the age of 18, 19, and they literally have real difficulties managing feelings. They don't know and they think that there's something really inadequate about them because they can't manage their feelings. They don't want to have a minute where they might allow feelings to come to the surface. Thoughts and feelings are dangerous. They need to be kept at bay and gotten rid of. You need to keep yourself busy the whole time to not allow feelings and thoughts to come into your mind because they're dangerous. The idea that you're going to sit on your own at your desk and try and study is terrifying to some students. That there's a real lack of ability to allow yourself to have feelings and know that you'll be able to survive them and you'll be able to come out the other end of it and calm yourself down. Is this horror really of losing control somehow and going insane. And also they don't talk to each other about their lives. Very, very often if I say to a student, who else knows that you're feeling like this? Nobody. They wouldn't dream of telling their friends. Oh my God, no. They'll talk about the symptom, they'll talk about the diagnosis, but they won't talk about the fact that they feel bad. They feel miserable, they feel frightened, they feel hopeless. They won't admit their vulnerabilities. It's almost like giving it a label gives it some kind of, I don't know whether it sanitizes it or detaches it from the actual feelings that people are experiencing.
You touched, Terry, on MITCircs and extenuating circumstances and the difficulty of making those accommodations for students in university. And I know that it's the same in schools and colleges. What sort of pressures has this put onto schools, colleges, universities?
Oh, I mean, huge. There's a huge burden, really. In maybe 10, 15 years ago, you might get half a dozen people in a year needing these letters in a whole service where you might be seeing 100 students in that year or 200. But now there are many, many students who contact the counselling services specifically just asking for a letter, to the point where, we had to bring in a rule to say, before we banned them altogether, we said that we won't give you a letter unless we've met with you at least twice. And they would come along to the appointment and, not really have anything to say or to talk about. They just wanted their letter. And it's actually quite a serious issue in universities because, there's a lot of money riding on it. If getting that letter is the difference between them having to retake the year or not, that's a lot of money you're talking about in terms of accommodation costs and living costs and tuition fees and all those other things. So it can put a huge amount of pressure on services to come up with the goods, to the point where, especially for international students where the fees are a lot higher, the costs are a lot greater, especially for people coming from poorer countries where sometimes the whole community's clubbed together to send them to university. There's a lot of pressure on those students to do well. And so getting that letter is very important. And we've even had students who bring along a relative who's a lawyer and come into this counselling session with them and almost, threaten that if you don't give them this letter, they're going to sue you.
Gracious. we've sort of created a reward system for having a diagnosis but also we've got growing numbers of distressed young people, and those people are also putting a pressure on services, aren't they? Because you presumably counselling services have grown. Very often the sort of first level of help is given by people who don't have any professional qualifications at all, who are perhaps sort of mentors or classroom assistants. What sort of pressures are those creating in schools and colleges?
Well, there are all sorts of people, as you say, and everything from emotional literacy support assistants to parent and family support advisors, and there are various attendance officers and so on. It's a very difficult one because often actually all a child needs is somebody to talk to. Years ago, there weren't all these professionals. They actually want somebody to talk to and somebody who will listen. And years ago, that would have been somebody in their family. But now we have so many dysfunctional, broken families. We have parents who are rushed off their feet. If both your parents get in at 6 p.m. and they're tired and they may have other things on their mind and they've got to feed you and they've got to make sure you've got clean clothes for the next day, they're not in a position for a child to speak to them. And in fact, quite a lot of children will say, I can't talk to my mum and dad. They've got a lot on their mind or they're going through some tough stuff. So the idea of a traditional support network where you actually have somebody to talk to and you can tell your problems to somebody has largely been lost. And instead, we have all these professionals and pseudo professionals and people with titles. As I say, there are people working in school who've done everything from 6 days of training through to you've got clinical psychologists who've done degrees and clinical practice and so on, and everything in between. So, there are a lot of people already there. But one of the fundamental problems is the sort of total dysfunction of the society that we're living in. Children are supposed to have a mum and a dad. They're supposed to be able to go home and talk to their parents. And, we're increasingly reaching a point where that isn't the case. A lot of children are parenting their parents. And we know that that is very bad for children. Children need to be able to rely upon somebody else, not be the ones being relied on. And the outcome of adultifying children is infantilized adults. So you're going to get people who are not well emotionally regulated, who are, as we said before, very reactive. They're not securely attached. They don't have deep emotional bonds with anybody. And these are the people who are showing up in school and in university. So, the answer is very complex. Even if we started now, you're not going to see results for years and years. And in the meantime, it falls to these various professionals in schools and colleges. And I'm afraid to say diagnosis. It's much easier. Well, okay, so this is how you feel. Okay, you've got that. And we may or may not have medication for it. But the problem is, there's a great quote from a book called Drop the Disorder, which is mental health issues are much more about broken hearts than broken brains. And I would say all the years that I've been working with young people, I would agree with that. Almost all the problems relate to relationships is the really big one, environment and the experiences they've had.
Yeah. And similarly in universities, when I first started working in universities, there was just a counselling service and we were all qualified, trained, experienced professionals, and we had a manageable workload, no waiting list. I remember once I had someone who told me that they felt suicidal. It was such a massive big deal that the whole team were running around trying to figure out how to respond to this person and how to keep them safe. Whereas nowadays, that's an everyday occurrence in every service across the country. So it grew from being just counsellors, and then they brought in the Special Education Leads Disability Act. So lots more people with mental health issues came to university, which is, a good thing. Everybody should be able to study if they want to. And then there was the explosion in self-diagnoses and pseudo-diagnoses. So you've then got to add on extra types of people because the counsellors weren't doing counselling with a lot of these people. They were directing them to other services, giving them advice. So you then started getting mental health advisors were employed. And the first one was in 1999, and it was a friend of mine. I remember when she got this newly created post at University of Coventry. It was a revelation because it was like nobody had ever thought of having a mental health advisor in a university before. And then they started bringing these to every university because they needed them in order to meet their requirements under the Disability Act. And then you add on other people like study support tutors, mental health mentors, body schemes, all kinds of additional support that's now part of the fabric of every university up and down the country. It's a huge industry and costs universities a lot of money, and it's part of their selling. The students look online when they want to go to university, and they look at their wellbeing services online and how they're ranked across compared to other services across the country, and they'll choose their university dependent on what kind of quality of mental health services are being run. And you'd get phone calls from social workers and psychologists out in the community before a student comes to university, ringing you up to say, what kind of support are you going to be able to offer X, Y, and Z person, because we're sending them to university. They saw university as a bit like occupational health, where they would come to university, they were really not able to cope. They just weren't able to manage to function on their own. But the university somehow has to try and pick that up and make it work. So yeah, it's grown hugely, and it's almost unmanageable nowadays.
Everybody involved in this is struggling against something that's larger than themselves, both the children and the young people, but also those trying to help and cope with it, and the families behind them as well. It's terrible. I know Bex wants to ask about the conversion bill, but and we touched on gender dysphoria a little earlier. So, Bex.
Yeah, so I mean, listening to that, I am thinking about where gender fits into this, because it's often sort of like Schrodinger's diagnosis. It's both, we're being told, it's something that's a mental health condition, gender dysphoria, and it needs treatment and medicalization and surgeries. And at the same time, it's innate and it's there from birth. When you hear these people speaking, a lot of their stories start with a general sort of vague sense of not fitting in or of dissatisfaction. And this has been presented to them as like a catch-all, maybe you're born in the wrong body, maybe you're, actually trans. How does that fit in with the sort of general trends we've been discussing with other mental health diagnoses?
I think it fits in quite well. I would start by saying there is no such thing as a trans child. If you feel such discomfort with your own body that you actually wish to disown it, harm it, leave it altogether, that is an indication that there is some very deep underlying distress. I wouldn't go so far as to say, there's a mental disorder. To me, it's no different than working with someone who is anorexic or who self-harms. It's a sign that there's something deeply wrong in your life. And as you'll probably know, a large majority of the children, young people, teenagers who identify out of being what they are girls. It's about 70%, I think, girls. And there are several reasons for this, I think. Two very big ones are domestic violence and pornography. The domestic violence, for example, when I was at university first a very long time ago, there have always been girls who've grown up in violent households. I remember meeting a girl who was, at the time, we regarded very feminist. I'm never going to depend on a man. I'm going to live my own life. I'm never going to live with a man. I will always have my own bank account and so forth, because I've seen how my mother is dependent on a violent man and can't leave. Now, there is a significant number of girls who take the view, if that is what it means to be a woman, women are weak, so I don't want to be one. I'm not going to be on the receiving end of a man's violence by opting out of being a woman. And I've heard this, or variations of that, very often. Then there's the whole issue of pornography, the vast majority of which is extraordinarily violent and degrading to women and involves all manner of sexual practices which were regarded as perverse and aberrant until very recently. And again, there are a lot of girls who have been on the receiving end of the attentions of what I call pornified boys, and they think, I'm not going to do this. If this is what being an adult woman involves, no thank you. I'm opting out. And at the same time, there are also boys, many fewer, who think if this is what it is to be a man, particularly if they may have grown up with a single mum or with sisters, if this is what being a man means, I don't think I am one. And then, of course, this is where you get the influence of sociogenic contagion, where you get the influence of social media. It's like, okay, so you're a bit uncertain about your place in the world. We can tell you where you fit in. Come and join our lovely glittery rainbow club and so on. And I've long been convinced with girls, it's not that they want to be boys or think they're boys. They're opting out of becoming women. There's a subtle difference there. These are not people who think, I'm so masculine or I want to do this. They just don't want to be an adult woman based on the experiences that they have had. And they've then opened the door to all manner of encouragement from elsewhere to join the rainbow community.
And we've also got the other massive issue, which is that from the Tavistock data, we know that about 80% of the kids attending the clinics at GIDS were same-sex attracted.
Mm-hmm.
So, at universities, it used to be a place where people could come out and discover themselves and find other gay people and have their identity as being lesbian or gay validated in an old-fashioned way, and not as it's how we use it now. But, you hear so many stories now of young people who have tried to come out as lesbian or gay at school. They've been teased and bullied and made to feel silly. And so they join the queer club, the Rainbow Club or whatever it's called, and they're introduced to queer theory where, it's much more attractive to label yourself as non-binary or gender fluid than it is to be lesbian or gay, because those are still very much dirty words for children in schools.
And you get very bizarre things, for example, like a girl who has declared that she is actually a trans boy and will tell you that she has a boyfriend. And there is then, for safeguarding reasons, and this is where it gets tricky, and this is where this conversion practices bill is possibly going to be so destructive and difficult to work around. I had to get used to, and this sounds crazy, but actually when you say you have a boyfriend, are we actually talking about a biological male or not? And then the girl will say, no, that actually, it's a trans boy like her. So in other words, you have two girls who are lesbian, who are in a relationship, who both believe themselves or wish to be boys and refer to themselves as gay men. And then you'll get a sort of blindsider of, we're going to look at gay pornography so we can see how it's done. And you're talking about maybe 15, 16-year-olds. And so, it opens such a can of worms, so many safeguarding issues that it's hard to know where to start. And my fear with the conversion practices bill is, even asking questions like this person with whom you're in a relationship, some of them will preempt you and go, you're going to ask what they really are, aren't you? And, depending on who I was working with, I would say, well, it is important. Another example, a girl, 15-year-old girl who, this was not somebody I worked with, but a colleague of mine did, 15-year-old girl identifying as a lesbian is in a relationship with a trans girl, i.e. somebody born a boy. And again, safeguarding issues. What is the nature of this relationship? Oh, well, we had sex once. And you say, well, so you had sex with a boy. No, I told you. So, trans girls are girls. So you almost end up having a kind of biology lesson. So, okay, this person has different genitalia from you. Yes, it's called a girl dick. And you just think, where do we go from here? And the risk is if you then start challenging this, you are in really dangerous territory already. But with a conversion practices bill, how are these conversations going to happen? And that's before you get to the people that identify as something different every week, of which there are quite a lot, or have a different name every week, different pronouns. And then there is, the cats and the foxes. And these are, small numbers, but they're there. They are, oh, I'm a fox. What are we supposed to do with that? Are we supposed to say, yeah, okay, off you go out into the woods? It's impossible to know. The people who've put this together have no idea what it's like on the ground in some of these different environments.
Let's talk about that then. Let's talk about the bill, because there's been a bit of chatter about it in the media, but I think we've seen a trend over the past few years where there's more and more awareness that maybe we're going in the wrong direction with gender. And this very much puts a stopper in any attempt to explore that. What effect is this going to have on therapists if this passes?
Well, the bill has tried to sell itself as having carved out space for therapists to practice. It says it doesn't apply to people in the medical profession carrying out any kind of medical treatment. But I'm not sure about that. The problem is with the people who draft these bills that they are from the kind of far left Marxist tradition where language is subverted and, words are violence. And so anything you say can be misinterpreted. And there's this whole idea that, therapists are protected unless they're seen to be, what is this phrase? Unless their practice falls far below that which would have be expected. It's like, I can imagine trans activists grabbing hold of that and trying to say that that is the case, that because you might have misgendered someone or you might have asked too many questions to try and make sense of the history of the self-diagnosis, then somehow you've fallen far below what would be expected of you. All of the terminology in the bill is incredibly nebulous and very difficult to define. And I know that in a court of law, it would be really hard to argue your case because we already have people that say that, if you won't call a man who's a woman, if you won't call people the gender that they want you to call them, then that's violence and it causes great alarm and distress. So it's very tricky. I mean, therapists are already working in fear because we have the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy and have had since 2017. So, we're already in fear. I guess one of my worries is, though, that how do we then work with parents, for example? What about if parents come to a therapist and they're trying to navigate their way through to support their child who's got some kind of distress around their gender? How do we support them parents? What do we say? Because all of the normal things that we would say as therapists are now likely to put that person in the line of danger for litigation. We can't say things like, you have to be honest with your child. I mean, you can't do that now if this bill were to pass.
Yeah, Lucy, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think there are a number of significant dangers because the bill is drafted so loosely. I mean, Terry already mentioned alarm and distress. Emotional distress is very subjective. I might say something to you which I think is perfectly reasonable. But if you find it emotionally distressing, you can make a complaint. I mean, we already have seen this in other aspects of the law where, particularly with things like non-crime hate incidents, it's the interpretation put upon it by the person on the receiving end which matters. There's no objective standard. There's no objective level at which something becomes offensive or not. It's entirely in the eye of the beholder, as it were. And that makes it very difficult, particularly as a lot of people are going to be emotionally distressed anyway. I mean, Terry mentioned the high numbers of children who experience same-sex attraction. Very large numbers of these children also have other diagnoses. And now, whatever we may think about individual diagnoses, they are distressed for a number of reasons about a number of things, and therefore they're likely to become emotionally distressed more easily than maybe some other people. So where do you, and as Terry's example was great, can you tell them the truth or not? And there are also going to be an awful lot of conflicting rights here, for want of a better word. The belief in there being only two sexes and that people can't change sex is a right protected in law. But if you say that to somebody, say that you personally don't believe that this is possible, that's going to conflict with, as Terry mentioned, the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy. It's going to maybe infringe somebody else's right to express themselves and be whoever they want. The only people who are going to win from this are lawyers, actually, because it's so much of it is going to be your word against mine and your interpretation of what I said. And that's quite before you actually get vexatious litigation. You get people who are determined to get their own back on, for want of a better word, the turfs. All these people who've been, been like this, we're going to get our own back. So, it's really, a mess of the most enormous magnitude, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there are already organizations, trans activist organizations who've put out on the internet the names of people they believe to be conversion therapists. I'm on there, and a number of thoughtful therapists are, as is the group itself, Thoughtful Therapists. They've done this spider chart of all the different groups that are all conversion therapy orientated. And so, there's not just the risk for individuals, but for organizations as well. Is there going to be space for academic endeavor around discussing these issues or campaigning around these issues? Are organizations going to be open to being sued if they're seen to be encouraging a more exploratory model?
It's a very scary thought, isn't it? I mean, it's such an authoritarian movement in so many ways.
Mm.
Is there a positive route through for therapists, or a way that things could be changed that would help you in your roles, help you to explore these things properly with your patients?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on our accepting that there is truth, that there is reality, that words mean things. They can't just be twisted. I mean, the whole conversion therapy thing is an interesting one in that exploratory therapy tries to enable someone who is distressed to look at their distress and to come to terms with their sexed body, which is an integral part of who they are. There's no conversion going on there. However, if you wish to change your body, or you wish to endorse the changing or affirm, a lifetime on hormones and medication that are going to change the characteristics of your body, surgery to turn you into a cosmetic approximation of something you can never be. That sounds a whole lot more like conversion to me than just talking to someone about their issues and exploring their distress. And yet, in this bizarre world we live in now, the conversion therapists are the ones who are actually holding the status quo. Whereas the people who actually wish to try to convert people are, affirmative, and that's all right. So I think it's about holding the language and holding on to the fact that there is actually reality. That, the very fact we're having this discussion is indicative of the kind of lunacy that has, engulfed us all. Those sort of examples that I was giving you earlier. Where are the adults in the room? Where are the people who say, you are not, I realize there are a whole lot of reasons why you might think this, but, this is how it is. I mean, this is the time when I, realized that I was probably, it was probably time I stopped doing therapy in, being a therapist or a counselor in school, is when, I found myself thinking what I should be doing as a responsible adult is very different from what my training, my membership body and everybody else expects me to do, which creates a dissonance in yourself, which is not a helpful thing. Because you feel you're failing these children. Children need adult containment and guidance and protection. And that has all been thrown out of the window.
Terry?
Yeah, I don't know what we do really. It feels like it's the higher powers that are funding these kinds of conversion therapy bills and conversion practices bills around the world. It's not just happening in the UK, it's all over the Western world. Many countries have already got them in place. It sometimes feels insurmountable in that it's so big and it's so global and it's so well funded and it's pushed through huge numbers of NGOs and charities and state institutions. It feels huge. And in that situation, I feel like the best that we can do is, like all humans in states of adversity, is to find others that you can seek similar feelings with and share problems and come together to try and find a way to continue to practice in a way that works for clients. We know what works. We were trained to do this job and we've been doing it a long time, like many of us. We know what works, and many other therapists out there are also aware of what works and want to continue doing that. And so, it's not just thoughtful therapists, but also lots of other organizations are opposing this conversion practices bill. We've got all kinds, Sex Matters and LGBT Alliance and all kinds of organizations will be opposing it. And I think the time is now really for our organizations to work together as much as that we can and try and hold some kind of central hub in this crazy, crazy world that we're living in.
Well, thank you both. I think that brings us on to our final question, which is, do you have a woman of the moment?
You can go first, Lucy.
Okay, I would like to nominate Catherine Birbalsingh as my woman of the moment. And I say that for a couple of reasons. And the most important one is she is running a school in North London, which has amazing results. But that to me isn't the most important thing. She is building a community there with children who come from all manner of different backgrounds, different ethnicities. And I spent the day there recently, and I was absolutely astonished at what she and her team there have achieved, and can see a huge a huge possibility there for addressing what we loosely call the mental health crisis. And I can just give a quick example in that they have family lunch. So the children are put on tables of 6, and visitors who are visiting the school get put on the table with them, and there's a teacher on the table on some of the tables. They're given a topic of the day to talk about. And I was thinking to myself, depression and anxiety, the two biggies. A lot of anxiety is about, talking to strangers or not knowing what to say. These children every day are sitting down with other people and they're given a subject to talk about. And I was sitting with a group of year 9s who were very engaged, wanted to know, not only where I'd come from and what I was doing and so on, but we then talked about the topic of the day, and they all had their own ideas, and they're made to feel part of something bigger than themselves. They're made to take responsibility for themselves and for others. And so much of what we've been talking about, if you address those things, you're equipping children, you're resourcing them to be resilient. And I think, what has come out of our discussion tonight is how extraordinarily lacking in both resources and resilience a lot of young people are. But that school, under Catherine Birbalsingh's leadership, is aiming to do something completely different, not just equip them with an academic education, which is very good, but also help children to be part of something, to believe in something beyond themselves, to have confidence, and to take responsibility. And I think if we did that on a large scale, the possibilities of changing the way a lot of children live would be amazing.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, that's a really interesting insight into what could be the way forward for education. Terry?
Well, I've pondered this question a lot today, and I alighted on a number of different people, but I'm going to go with Stella O'Malley. And the reason is because I've known Stella now for about 5 or 6 years. She's part of Thoughtful Therapists. And since that time, she's set up so many different organizations. She's absolutely full of energy. I don't know where she gets the time to do all of this from. She's done huge amounts of work behind the scenes that never gets noticed, that nobody really knows happens. She set up GenSpect. She does huge amounts of work with parents, support groups for parents, she's set up Beyond Trans, which is for people who are not sure they've done the right thing and are thinking of detransitioning or desisting. They run support groups for those people. They also pay for their therapy. So I've worked with people who GenSpect and Beyond Trans have paid for. She has this conference that she runs, which is a huge conference. I've been to 3 of them now, and they're enormous. And they have all the top delegates from around the world meeting once a year in competition with WPATH. They always meet in the same town as WPATH conference to try and show an alternative, non-medicalized approach to gender distress. I just think her amount of energy and enthusiasm has supported so many other people and organizations to grow and develop over the years. And she doesn't get really a great deal of public credit for it.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to say Stella O'Malley.
What an excellent pick. Well done, Stella. Thank you both so much for joining us. That was absolutely fascinating.
We've been
Thank you
really
so-
looking forward to it, and it's just been better than we thought, hasn't it, Bex?
It really has, yeah. Thank you.
You are welcome. Could have gone on for ages.
Yeah, no, thank you very much indeed. Lovely to meet you both.
Thank you to our listeners. We really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff to help keep our channel growing and spread the word. Thank you.